Today's guest is a vascular neurologist at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, Dr. Matthew Schrag. He's an MD and a PhD, and I believe this is one of the most important conversations that we've had on the show so far. In 2022, Dr. Schrag was a whistleblower on a landmark 2006 Alzheimer's research study, uncovering massive fraud, data manipulation, image manipulation, and he brought these findings to the FDA and the NIH. Now, 20 years of Alzheimer's research was wasted in the wrong direction based on this false report. Billions of dollars in research and funding and medication in the wrong direction. Today, we discuss how he got into neurology, how he discovered this massive fraud, what he did about it, the failings of the FDA and the NIH in attacking this fraud, how to prevent Alzheimer's, how to treat Alzheimer's, and how you can lower your risk for developing neurodegenerative diseases. Today's guest, Dr. Matthew Schrag. Dr. Matthew Schrag, thanks for being here today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. Well, I've been wanting to talk to you for a long time because Alzheimer's is really near and dear to my heart. I've had multiple family members die from it. My uncle was just diagnosed. It affects millions of people. And so we're going to get into your role in discovering a major fraud in the Alzheimer's research space back in 2006. So I want to do a quick introduction for you so the guests know who you are and a few statistics. So Dr. Matthew Schrag, you're a board-certified vascular neurologist and assistant professor of neurology at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, where you also serve as director of the Cerebral Amyloid Angiopathy Clinic. You completed medical school and a doctoral degree in biochemistry at Loma Linda University, a neurology residency and research fellowship at Yale, and a vascular neurology fellowship at Vanderbilt, where you joined the faculty in 2016. Your research focuses specifically on how vascular disease in the brain contributes to Alzheimer's and cognitive decline. You're also an investigator with the Vanderbilt Alzheimer's Disease Research Center and a collaborator on the Vanderbilt Memory and Aging Project. In 2022, you became the central figure in one of the most significant scientific fraud investigations in modern medicine, exposing manipulated data in a landmark 2006 Alzheimer's study that had shaped 2 decades of research, 2,000 papers have cited it, and billions wasted in drug development, and roughly 20 million deaths worldwide from Alzheimer's since 2006. The cost of caring for people with Alzheimer's and other dementias is a $400 billion annual industry, and according to the Alzheimer's Association, between 2002 and 2024, the number of deaths in the U.S. due to Alzheimer's disease has more than doubled, increasing by 134%. Alzheimer's is the 6th leading cause of death in America, and the lifetime risk for Alzheimer's disease is roughly 1 in 5 women and 1 in 10 men. And more than 1 in 9 Americans 65 and older have Alzheimer's disease. So is all that about accurate?
Yeah, it's funny when you go to introduce this topic, you start describing to people the scale of this problem, and most people start nodding their heads, and you realize that when you're talking to the average person on the street, almost everybody has interacted with this problem. The number of families that are directly affected by this is getting to a point where it's almost everybody. It is a huge, huge problem. And the interesting thing is we've, in medicine, made so much progress over the last 150 years, and we've extended the average lifespan. But a lot of the value of that has been carved away by this disease. If those last few years of your life are not of meaningful quality, the value of all that hard-earned medical advancements to extend life are eroded. And so this isn't just a neurology problem. This is really a generational problem that we need to tackle.
Absolutely. And so for those out there that aren't familiar, can you describe what a vascular neurologist is and what you do?
So I'm trained to take care of patients who've had strokes, right? So the vascular neurology refers to essentially the plumbing of the brain, the blood vessels of the brain, and making sure that we're treating patients to improve the health of their blood vessels, which is a little bit surprising. I remember when I started this, having worked for a long period of time on Alzheimer's disease, a lot of my colleagues asked, why on earth would you become a vascular specialist? We don't think of Alzheimer's disease as a vascular disease, but it turns out a big part of what's going on in the brain in Alzheimer's disease is vascular, and I think that's been overlooked.
And so that's from cardiovascular health deteriorating and causing issues in the brain.
Right, so that's one avenue where your blood vessels can affect your brain, but there's also some pathways directly related to Alzheimer's disease that attack the blood vessels. So some of this is about your general health and how it affects cognitive aging, and some of it is specifically about how the molecules involved in Alzheimer's disease attack the blood vessels and how that changes the way the brain works.
Okay. And so we'll dive into it as we go along, but blood flow to the brain, that oxygen to the brain, and that health is kind of the direction of what causes Alzheimer's.
That's a big piece of it, right? We classically have thought about Alzheimer's disease as having two primary problems. One is that you're accumulating clumps of this protein called beta amyloid and forming plaques in the brain. And these plaques are outside of the cells, in between the neurons, and it's thought to be poisonous. The other thing that happens is that a protein that's important for the structure of neurons is clumping inside of neurons. So you have these two clumped proteins, but they're in different places in the brain and doing different things. And that seems to be critical to how the disease progresses.
Mm.
But what's overlooked is that the clumps of beta amyloid outside of the cells can also clump on the blood vessels and damage how they work. I remember when I was thinking about becoming a vascular neurologist, one of the people I worked for said, "Why would you want to become a plumber?" And but this is the most elaborate plumbing imaginable,
Mm.
right? When you look at how the brain works, it requires a massive amount of energy. And in order to make that work, you have to fine tune the amount of blood supply going to a particular part of your brain. So when you think about something, the area of your brain that activates, what gets all those neurons firing, also suddenly needs much more blood supply. So these blood vessels are in an elaborate dance, delivering nutrients and oxygen to the right part of your brain at the right time. And when you damage that structure, you start to undermine the functioning of the neurons.
Okay, that makes sense. So growing up, did you know that you wanted to be a vascular
No,
neurologist?
I had no idea what I wanted to do growing up. It's funny because I have two brothers. I'm in the middle. And my big brother and my little brother knew from the time they were little kids what they wanted to do. And I was the family screw up. I hadn't the foggiest idea what I was going to do. In fact, I think I had a letter of admission to medical school and still wasn't sure I was going.
So growing up, what did you originally, teenage years, kind of think you wanted to do?
Well, I would have told you I didn't have a clue as a teenager. And then at some point I said I was going to be an engineer, and I think I would have turned out to be a miserable engineer. And then, I thought briefly about law, and that just didn't end up thrilling me at the end of the day. And so I remember when I called my parents to tell them I'd gotten into medical school, I think they were astonished. And then when I told them I wasn't sure I was going, they said, "Well, that's the Matthew we know."
So were they in the medical field growing up, or what did they do?
Well, my dad was in the service. He was in the Air Force,
Okay.
and he was an Air Force officer. And when he retired, he went back and became a nurse. And he worked in a variety of settings, mostly in ICUs. And so there was some exposure to the medical field. And my mother actually stayed home to homeschool us when we were kids.
Oh,
And
nice.
when we graduated, she went to college right along with us and beat us out and became an IRS agent for a number of years and now
Oh,
works in
wow.
in finance and internal auditing for a big corporation. And yeah,
Man,
she's done great.
my fiance and I, we want to homeschool. How was that experience for you?
Well, I think it's much more mainstream now than it was then. My kids tell their friends and their parents that they're homeschooled and nobody blinks now.
Mm.
And I remember as a kid when we would tell people, people would either ask, "What is that?" or they would ask, "Why?" And I think now it's much more mainstream. But it worked fine. My dad was in the service and we were moving a lot. And so it had provided some continuity. And my parents, I think, were very good at it. And so,
Yeah, and people are like, "Well, don't you want them to be socialized in society?" And then I look around at society and I'm like, No.
Maybe not. Yeah, well, I have to say that you have to take every child for who they are and make sure the solution works for them. But I think when you have outgoing children, they'll figure it out, and
Mm,
there are other avenues to have those connections. But those connections are important, and I think we can treat that concern dismissively,
mm.
and it is, I think, an important thing to think about. But we were, I think, all inclined to be pretty social.
So with your and we'll get into your story, kind of really speaking out against a very large medical industry. Growing up, did you feel like you had any kind of, I don't want to say issue with authority, but just kind of this pushback of
No,
institutions or things like
I
that?
I don't think I don't think that. I think I was mild mannered might be overstating things. I certainly had some opinions, and I love to talk to people and get into debates about how things were. And but no, I mean, I think this isn't really how I ever envisioned my career going. But I think at some point you decide what you want to be known for, and sometimes things are important and they're worth stepping out of character for.
What specifically led you to vascular neurology? Were you interested in neurology and then it kind of snowballed?
Yeah, I don't know. I think a lot of this just happened.
Mm.
I think when I decided I was going to have a serious look at medical school, I talked to a medical student at the university I was at and said, "What do I need to do to get in?" And they said, "Well, you should probably do some research." And, I was pretty naive at the time. So I went to my favorite professor, a biology professor, and said, "Can I come and do some research with you?" And he said, "Son, they did not mean botany." So he very generously walked me over to a new laboratory run by a gentleman named Othman Greeby, who was studying Alzheimer's disease. And so that was really happenstance. And I got reeled in. I
From the
just
very beginning.
really, really fell in love with that work and what we were doing. And
Have you had any family members or friends have Alzheimer's?
yeah, no, I think like a lot of folks that I had seen this. My folks always felt that we should be volunteering and giving back to the community when we were teenagers. And so, I spent some time at the nursing home getting to know some older folks and had definitely seen it up close and personal. And there were a few distant family members who had had Alzheimer's severely and a couple that were closer who had had mild memory
Mm.
problems. And so I'd had a chance to interact with it a little bit. But again, I don't think it started out as some major passion. It just sort
Mm.
of happened that I ended up in this laboratory and got reeled in. I had no burning interest in being a scientist. It sort of, I got hooked.
And was this the early 2000s or what time frame?
Yeah, it would have been 2004, 5, 6, something like that.
Okay. And then so as we go along, it might have changed over time, but based on as you got more familiar with Alzheimer's, after you got your degrees, after you started practicing, did you ever feel any internal skepticism about where the treatment and research of Alzheimer's was headed before you got into this case?
Yeah, I think that a lot of people in this space had the sense that there just wasn't a lot of progress. You didn't have to be a rocket scientist to see that, one, the treatments that we had were woefully underperforming. And we're all grateful to have them. They're better than nothing, right? But they're really not enough. And anybody who has used the traditional Alzheimer's drugs like Aricept knows that they're useful, but they're not a game changer. Um, and I think that the leading theories of the field, the amyloid hypothesis in particular, had been this dominant driving concept of how the disease worked. And it basically said that the plaque, the extracellular sort of the clump of proteins in between the cells, was the primary driver of the disease, that this was the first domino in a series of toxic events that led to Alzheimer's disease.
And
And
was that really solidified in 2006 or was that like the 90s where that
no, this had
started?
been around for quite a while by then. Right. So for more than a decade, this had been a dominant theory in the field. And I think a lot of people that I worked with complained that if you wanted to explore other ideas, it was very hard to get funding. It was
Mm.
very hard to get support. So there were a lot of grumblings in
That
the
was kind of shut down. They're like, don't even look over there. We have the answer. Or
Yeah,
this is the route.
that was certainly the opinion of a lot of people I worked with at the time. The quiet conversations in the corners at conferences where, I can't really get traction on X, Y, or Z issue. And so often people people would take those issues and try to bend them around the amyloid hypothesis to make them
Mhm.
more appealing.
So the funding in this whole ecosystem was really forcing people into a certain path.
That was the feeling,
Yeah.
right? And I think there are people who would object to that characterization, but I think that it was a legitimate complaint of a lot of investigators at the time, was that if you wanted to go another route, that
Mhm.
you would meet a lot of pushback and potentially have difficulty getting funding and keeping the lab making forward progress.
Okay, so starting from the beginning, can you explain what is Alzheimer's
Yeah.
and then how this kind of progresses in middle age until it starts showing symptoms?
Yeah, so about 120 years ago, Dr. Alzheimer's discovered this disease, and he encountered a relatively young woman, younger than the average person who has Alzheimer's, named Auguste Dieter, who had an unusual set of symptoms that we would now recognize as dementia. She had profound difficulty remembering things. She would get words mixed up. She wasn't able to talk very well, and was living in an asylum because she wasn't able to take care of herself. And when she died, he performed an autopsy and looked at her brain, and he found those two markers that we talked about. The plaques, which were clumps of proteins in between neurons, outside of the cells of the brain, in the space in between all the cells, and then these twisted tangles of proteins inside of neurons. And those two features now have been recognized for 120 years, and we've learned a lot more about them in the intervening time, but they still define this disease, is the presence of these two problems. And in the 70s and 80s, there was concern that toxicity from aluminum might be driving this, and at some point that was dropped as probably not true. And there was some point of view that degeneration of certain pieces of the brain at the base of the brain might be impairing the secretion of neurotransmitters, especially acetylcholine. And eventually, I think people figured out that that was causing some of the symptoms, but was not driving the disease. And so there had been a series of ideas that had been discarded, and many more than those two. And in the 90s, especially the early 90s, there was a genetic revolution, and a couple of families with mutations that ran in their family were identified. Um, and those genes seem to drive the production of beta amyloid. And so that became the dominant theory on the basis primarily of the genetics in these rare families.
Because there's certain genetic testings that can test to see if you're more predisposed to develop it.
There are. So these genes are even rarer than that. This affects a small fraction of a percent of the total patients with Alzheimer's disease, but they get a horrible, very aggressive version of it. And it's driven by a collection of mutations in genes called presenilin or APP. And these two genes are directly related to the production of beta amyloid. And the thing we like about genetics is that we think we can infer that the mutation caused the disease, right? And that's useful to say, what actually is causing this. And that's where the idea came from, that beta amyloid could be the primary driver. And that really dominated the field for the next, it's probably still continues to dominate the field.
And so getting into that amyloid hypothesis, do you feel like that is correct? Do you feel like it's partially correct and there's just more to the story?
Right. So I think that you can treat this dismissively, right? I
Mhm.
think it's fundamentally not correct. I think that we have
Okay.
enough data to say that the amyloid hypothesis is wrong. But I think that sometimes people can dismiss the whole story and say, okay, then amyloid has nothing to do with it. And that's also not viable. Amyloid absolutely has something to do with what's going on. You can't look at the brain under a microscope and see so much of this protein accumulating there that doesn't belong there
Mhm.
and say that that has nothing to do with it. It's just not viable.
So that is there at the scene of the accident, but something else might be driving all of
Exactly
this.
right. Exactly right. And so I think that what we know now is that there have been all of these clinical trials looking to remove beta amyloid from the brain, some of which have been very effective at removing beta amyloid from the brain. And we're not seeing a major shift in the
Mhm.
patient's trajectory. In many of those trials, nothing happened at all.
So it might be cleaning up that plaque, but it's not addressing what's driving this.
That's the concern, is that the plaques could be pretty far downstream. And Now I think that the more modern, more complete formulation of this disease is that these clumps of proteins, wherever they are, the plaques or the tangles, or also a lot of other proteins that don't belong there, are waste products, and that the brain fundamentally has a problem managing its waste.
Mm.
It's sort of like when the garbage men in New York City go on strike,
Mhm.
right? If you picked one very specific kind of garbage to get rid of, like tin cans, would you make this scenario better? Maybe nominally, but it doesn't address the underlying problem. And I think that that's what we're seeing is
Mhm.
that when you remove beta amyloid, you may just slightly improve patients' situation, but you're not addressing the cause of the disease. And so we're not having a major effect on patients' trajectory.
And I guess by that time, they're probably already showing symptoms if they're getting on this medication, and so the idea is that that damage has already been done.
Yeah. And I have to say that there's that's absolutely a possibility is
Mhm.
that you need to treat early. A lot of neurological diseases behave that way. That if you allow the damage to become too advanced, the brain is a pretty sensitive organ and it may be hard to unring that bell. And so that's a perfectly legitimate concern. Um, but also, we've been moving the time point of treatment back for a prolonged period of time. And so now we're treating patients earlier and earlier and seeing the same basic outcomes. And you could, in theory, keep moving the time point back forever.
Mhm.
Right. And so at some point, you have to ask, yes, this is legitimate, that it may be that we need to start earlier. But at what point do we just listen to the outcomes of the trials and say biology is trying to tell us we're on the wrong track?
Hmm.
So I certainly wouldn't rule out the possibility that if we got this started earlier, there could be more value.
And do you feel like the institution has accepted that and is moving to open up other ideas, or are they still firmly on this amyloid track?
Yeah, I think that that's I mean, it seems like a simple question. I think that's a very complicated question. I do think that there are components of the system that are now more open to having these conversations. And I think particularly the basic science setting. I think the NIH is now funding a broader portfolio, and they would tell you that they had been doing that for some time. The problem is when you lock down the funding for a period of time, you don't just snap your fingers and get the next drug to go after the next target, right? It takes a while to develop those things. And so the effects of things that were done, in the past few decades can linger a surprisingly long time. And I think that the clinical development is still extremely amyloid focused.
Okay. And so, based on where you're at right now in your research, do you feel like Alzheimer's is luck of the draw? Are there telltale signs, or is there any mitigating things we can do?
Yeah, I think that there are some things that you can control and there's some things you can't. Alzheimer's disease for most people, is not classically genetic in the sense that you have a particular gene and you inherit it in a dominant way. There are these very rare families that have that. But for most people, that's not how it behaves. But it's still genetic in a more complicated way where hundreds and hundreds of genes pool together
Mm.
to increase your risk. And so some of this is about how you're wired and is probably outside of our control. But there are certainly, I think, progressively becoming more aware of the contribution of other things to this. We certainly know that high blood pressure is a big contributor. So staying healthy and paying attention to your vascular health, especially your blood pressure, matters. In fact, in the clinical trial landscape for Alzheimer's disease, that may be one of the very few bright spots is that aggressive blood pressure control seems to really help. There are epidemiological studies that show us that staying physically fit, especially in midlife, matters. Controlling your cholesterol matters. Not smoking matters. Not being around certain types of pollution matters. And so there are a variety of factors that are clearly contributing to this disease. And you get the impression that this is a complicated disease,
Mm.
that it's unlikely that one single domino is going to be the first domino.
Right.
And it goes back to why the amyloid hypothesis, in retrospect, was off track to begin with. When you think about diseases of aging, can you think of one that has a single solitary cause?
Mm.
Like, it's just not how
Yeah.
diseases at the end of life generally behave, right? Tend at the end of life to see really complicated diseases. Cancer and diabetes and retinal disease, all of these things have very complicated mixes of causes, some of which is genetic, some of it is things you're exposed to, some of it is things that happened very long ago in your life that are now interacting with aging. And so that complicated mixture, I think, is part of what makes these diseases so challenging.
Mm. It's very individualistic based on lifestyle, based on all those factors you just said. So as we get into your story, I have some notes on this. So there were a lot of drug trials targeting amyloid, and there were billions spent on this. If there were already ideas and rumblings that this is on the wrong track and these were brought to NIH and these people in these positions, why do you think that was ignored?
Well, I think that everybody wants to bet on the idea that's most likely to succeed, right? I mean, if you knew for sure that one particular pathway was going to produce a drug that was going to be successful, you'd put all your resources
Mhm.
there. And so I think that a lot of what was happening was driven by true believers, people
Mhm.
who really felt strongly about this genetic background, right? That you could infer a lot from the genetics of this disease. And so, a lot of it may well have been well intentioned, but I think that you need to have an economy of good ideas bouncing off of each
Mm.
other. That competition is part of what makes sure that we're advancing the best
Mm.
ideas. I think when you put your thumb on the scale, even if it's well intentioned, it has the potential to cause harm.
Mm.
Right. And I think that seems in retrospect to be what happened in this case is that we really doubled down collectively on this amyloid hypothesis. And the amyloid hypothesis was fundamentally, not crazy, right?
Mhm.
That genetic association is very interesting. And had it worked, I think would have been viewed as a major success. But I think that the uh, real reluctance to make a change and to maintain diversity in ideas
Mhm.
in this marketplace is part of what's held this field back.
I know not to get we could completely get derailed off topic on this, but in COVID and the vaccine development, and this is the only thing, this is full steam ahead, we ignore everything. It seems very reminiscent of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in a lot of domains we've made certain mistakes, and I think scientists may be a little bit prone to overconfidence, and I
Mhm.
think that coming at this with a little bit of modesty is useful. And I also think that there's a certain amount of practicality that is also really helpful, right? Embracing the complexity of a disease rather than sort of dismissing it and trying to simplify it into terms that are easier to understand, right? It's actually hard to say, no, I accept the fact that this is a very complicated disease and there's a lot of factors that play into it. And, that may make it more challenging to treat. But this, I think, is a key point. We think of the brain as being very complicated and very hard to treat. But the truth is, we're in the middle of a renaissance for neuroscience, right?
Really?
When you look at how we treat stroke, it has completely morphed over the last 20 years. Our tools to take care of patients who have had, big, dangerous strokes are now vastly better than they were before. Patients are often surviving things that would have previously been fatal or
Mhm.
disabling. It's a dramatic difference. I remember as a medical student being on the stroke service and thinking it was the saddest service in the hospital. And now on that service, we get big wins. Not that everybody does well. So, this is still a dangerous disease and it's a top 10 killer too.
Mhm.
But we're seeing this huge improvement. And if you go through neurology, you see that a lot.
Mhm.
Epilepsy now is surprisingly treatable, right? We've got dozens of drugs, many of which are very effective. Many patients can be treated with surgery, many of them cured with
Mhm.
surgery. And so this disease, which in previous generations was horribly disabling, now for most patients is a chronic controllable disease. Multiple sclerosis is very much
Mhm.
that way. So we're seeing neurological disease after neurological disease really becoming controllable and treatable. And we're missing that in the neurodegenerative diseases.
And do you feel like that's because of the complexity of it?
I think it's because there's problems with research integrity in
Okay.
this space. Now, again, I don't want to overly simplify this. I
Right.
think there's a lot of reasons why this is hard, but
That is the big thing you could point to.
I worry that this is part of what's held this space back. It's easy to say these are complicated, difficult diseases, but other complicated, difficult neurological
Mm.
diseases are cracking.
Mm.
And I think that we should believe we can make progress on this one.
Yeah. And I agree with you. That seems like a very easy way to deflect and sweep this under. Well, it's very complicated, but then that creates a cover for a lot of misappropriated funds or just a lot of these things that could be incentivizing this.
Yeah.
So I want to dive in. So in August of 2021, is that when kind of all this started for you? So you got a phone call or someone reached out. Can you walk me through the beginning of this? What happened?
So I got a phone call asking me if I would help a group of lawyers and whistleblowers, a couple of physician scientists, who were concerned about the integrity behind an Alzheimer's disease clinical trial. There was a little company called Cassava Sciences out of Austin, Texas, that was developing a drug, and it was sort of tangential to the amyloid hypothesis. So this was a drug that was supposed to block the toxicity of beta amyloid by preventing it from interacting with a particular receptor on.
And how did they find you? They just
So I had had some media appearances because the anti-amyloid drugs had been ramping up, and
I
I had
see.
been publicly critical of that. So I had been, talking to the Washington Post and the National Geographic, and so I think that they wanted somebody, one who had the expertise in the image analysis space, but also who had some media experience to talk about these things. And so they asked if I would, one, due diligence this for them, help them, help the lawyers make sure that the complaints that they were being given were reasonable, and then assist with writing up documents and adding to the research that had been done. And it turned out that I thought they were right, that this group of whistleblowers had found some pretty alarming things in the clinical trials and the preclinical work related to this drug, which was called sumufilum. And essentially, we saw some cut and paste type changes in the background experiments that looked like there had been some Photoshop work done to potentially change the outcomes. And some of the experiments were just things that didn't seem feasible. Like they were claiming that they could do certain types of pharmacological experiments on human brain tissue that was dead. That really would require living tissue
Mm.
to accomplish. And so there were quite a series of big red flags in this case that bothered me. And I think what most worrisome is that they were about to move from phase 2 to phase 3 clinical trials, which would have meant that they would enroll potentially thousands of patients in a drug trial.
So up until this point, they weren't signing people, humans
No,
up.
they were, but smaller numbers. So
Okay.
they had this striking phase 2 clinical trial where they enrolled a small number of patients. And instead of looking at patients' clinical outcomes, they decided to look at biomarkers. So they
Mm.
drew cerebrospinal fluid. They did a spinal tap on these patients. And they wanted to show that Alzheimer's disease markers in the cerebrospinal fluid improved after treatment with this drug. And what had happened was they sent this material off to a laboratory, and it came back with very disappointing results. It didn't show much of an effect. But then they claimed there were some anomalies in that data, and they wanted to get it reanalyzed independently. And they sent it to a supposedly independent lab. And it turned out the independent lab was one of the individuals who was on the patent for this and had worked extensively with this company for a very long period of time. And surprise, all of the outcomes were incredibly positive. And this shot the stock price for Cassava Sciences to the moon. It became one of the biggest growth stocks on the NASDAQ that year and sort of was a meme stock. And I think that was one of the big red flags that tipped off these investors. So there was this really surprising disconnect between the first analysis and the second.
Mm. And so you start to discover these, and it would take a specialist to really know what you're looking at and break this down.
Well, you need some background,
Yeah.
I think, to understand the experiments that are involved. But I think a lot of people could look at what we were seeing and understand that it made sense.
Mhm.
That these images, it's sort of like when you see a magazine in a rack and you look at an image that looks a little unnatural. And you're like, I
Okay.
feel like that's been photoshopped. Or now, when we see something that's AI generated and we're like, it's just a little funny,
And
right?
so this drug company, correct me if I'm wrong, this drug company that was running this research study that you were hired to look into, they themselves were kind of manipulating documents to get this drug approved.
Well, and that was the allegation, right?
Okay.
Was that somebody in this mixture had their thumb on the scale, was altering the data. And it's hard when you look at publicly available data to point your finger at people and say, all right, this person did it, because these things progress in teams. But it seemed like these things were egregious enough that the key players involved were either involved or should have known about these problems. And certainly the differences between those cerebrospinal fluid analyses should have raised alarm bells for people.
Mm.
You know, the results from the redo experiment, from the second experiment, were just unbelievably perfect, and that's just not how most experiments work biologically.
And so in this discovery period, did you figure out that there was at that supposedly independent lab, there was a conflict of interest, or is that something the attorneys pulled out eventually?
Yeah, I think that was recognized by the team already. But
Okay.
one of the things that we helped with was rapidly processing the scientific output from this lab and also major collaborators. And what we saw was that there were huge problems with the data associated with Cassava Sciences, but also these scientists. Other work was also compromised. We were
Mm.
seeing the same patterns of problems throughout their work over a span of decades. And so it was clear to me at that point that there was a huge problem around this drug and the clinical trials that needed to be dealt with right away. But also, it seemed like there was something broader going on that also needed to be looked at.
So they might have been doing this with other diseases or drugs or realms, not just Alzheimer's.
Right. What we were seeing is that their research also about Alzheimer's disease, but not connected to this company, had similar patterns of problems, and it seemed to involve other collaborators. And so essentially you're pulling on a string and starting to see things unravel in a broader story than what was initially apparent.
So they call you and you're like, okay, yeah, I can definitely check that out.
Yeah.
I can look into this. At what point when you started pulling that string were you thinking, oh, like there's something here?
Yeah, I have to say that sometimes it's worrisome when things are too easy, right? When you start doing these investigations and the problems just compound very rapidly. You know, it does sort of force you to stop and say, all right, how big is this problem? How much of this is out there? How much more is there than just what's going on in this group, right? Is this one isolated incident or is there a lot more? And I think that question, you know, had me looking at other scientists in the general intellectual space to get a sense of how much more of this is going on. And that's where we stumbled across this big 2006 paper. You know, I was looking for similar types of manipulation. And I found in the work from this other scientist, Sylvain Lesney, who had nothing at all to do with Cassava Sciences. But the pattern of changes in his work was very reminiscent of what was going on in theirs. And so we started pulling on that thread as well and realized, you know, that this was just ballooning into a very big problem, you know, dozens and dozens, hundreds of papers.
And so now were you working alongside a team of colleagues or who was attacking
Well, you
this?
know, initially I had worked with this group of whistleblowers and their attorneys, and at some point we decided, all right, there's got to be a stopping point for this particular issue because they needed to go after this clinical trial. That to us seemed like a massive ethical issue.
And stopped this before it could start.
Right. So they drew some boundaries around that and decided what they were going to pursue, and we collectively sent a statement to the FDA asking for the trial to be stopped, which surprisingly they never did.
Okay, so how far along are you in your career at this point? When you s
I'm an assistant professor, so I'm pretty junior at that point. I'm pre-tenure.
And so now you're sending a letter to the FDA, kind of bringing up all the inconsistencies on
Right.
this that's about to go to phase 3 trials?
Right. So the attorneys end up submitting this, but I drafted this for them, and they, you know, the whistleblowers and their attorneys produced the final document and submitted it.
Okay.
And so it was a group of us collectively that contributed to this document. But the point was, there are huge problems in both the, you know, preclinical, which is mouse and cell type work, that proved there was some reason for this drug to even be looked at in the first place. And then also in the phase 2 clinical trial data, that there seemed like there were just huge numbers of red flags that should prompt an investigation. And it absolutely prompted an investigation. Those complaints, I think, were taken seriously and were pursued by multiple federal
By the
agencies.
FDA?
Well, by multiple federal agencies, including the Justice Department, the SEC, and in a variety of other enforcement agencies, and at some point the NIH as well. But the FDA declined to take action to stop the clinical trial, which I just found astonishing.
Why do you think they did that?
Well, I don't know for sure. My impression was that when we brought these concerns to them, we didn't show clear evidence of danger. So even though the evidence that we provided that the basis for this was likely missing or manipulated, we didn't show them that the drug was inherently dangerous, which still is a possibility, right? You
Mhm.
don't know everything about these drugs when you do these clinical trials, and I think that that's what it probably would have taken to get them to move. But I still, find that very hard to square. I think there are
Yeah.
other forms of harm rather than direct toxicity.
So even though you were able to show, hey, there is possibly intentional fabricated data to support this, and it's warranting investigations by the Department of Justice, all these other agencies, the FDA still didn't do anything or
Right.
didn't stop it from going to
Right, and I
trials.
have to say, it is an opaque organization, and so it's hard to know exactly what they did and didn't do, but what they certainly didn't do is stop the clinical trials.
Do you feel like the FDA is a captured agency by like the pharmaceutical industry?
Well, there are certainly concerns about this. In some ways, there are a lot of the same actors in these domains. People who are working in the pharmaceutical world can move into the FDA and vice versa. At the time, there was a gentleman named Billy Dunn who was a key player in the regulatory process at the FDA for the approval of aducanumab, which was the first anti-amyloid immunotherapy to get FDA approval. And after going through that process, shortly thereafter, he left the FDA and promptly went to work for a company, Prothena, that was working on developing anti-amyloid therapies. And so we see this, back and forth between the regulators and the industry, which does raise concerns,
Mhm.
that there may be too much coziness. And in fact, there was a congressional investigation into whether these relationships were too cozy. And I think that has been fairly described as a scathing report that they produced.
Yeah, because it makes sense that if the one agency regulating these drug companies and they have billions, if not trillions of dollars at their disposal, a position when you're done, or I might be wrong, but I feel like I've seen CEOs or members who've worked for Pfizer then go to work for the FDA and vice versa.
Yeah. Well, I think fundamentally, we have to ask what the role of the FDA is. And if it has a legitimate role in regulating clinical trials and approving what drugs come to market, then you have to ask, is there any legitimate basis for not intervening on simifelim? Right? This was a drug where the evidence that we had provided from purely um, publicly available data sets was frankly very, very substantial. And if that didn't justify stopping the trial, I mean, it seems like an agency that can't take action. And
Mhm.
that to me is alarming. That seems like one of its fundamental roles is to prevent this kind of abuse. And again, I think the fact that a drug has toxicity is hugely important. And the fact that this one didn't, I understand why that's a factor, but also patients lose opportunity,
Mhm.
right? You can only participate in so many clinical trials, and many patients only participate in one. It's very
Especially if you
hard.
have an end stage disease or
Exactly.
something.
Exactly. And so I think that you're denying people the possibility of participating in a clinical trial that might actually benefit them or might actually benefit society.
So, do you feel like the FDA is an institution that needs to be there, but it has potentially become corrupt? Or what's your thoughts on the FDA now that you've seen this?
Well, I think this was eye-opening. I think that I came away from this thinking that there was a lot less teeth there than I thought, that it was predominantly bureaucracy and that the primary role of the FDA, what I viewed as the primary role of the FDA doesn't really seem to be there. And I think a lot of ink has been spilled on the whys underlining that. And I'm not sure I'm in a position to deeply understand. I view it as a pretty opaque organization, and
Mhm.
I think exactly where it's gone off the rails, I don't know. But
Kind
in
of
this
like the
case, it unquestionably was off the rails.
So kind of like how we could view our entire government. It's a very opaque, lot of hand. It's just very hard to pinpoint the people or what's going on. So investigating this drug, did they go to phase 3 trials? Did they
They
allow
did.
it?
They did. They ran 2 parallel phase 3 trials, enrolled something in the neighborhood of 1,900 patients.
1,900 patients
And
who
you'll be
had a neurodegenerative disease.
correct. And you'll be shocked to learn there was no benefit from the drug. So when we filed our report with the FDA, the company had a market cap of something around $5.2 billion. And over the coming months, as these allegations played out, it dropped precipitously. and they've lost over $5 billion in market cap from this. They have settled with the SEC for settling with a huge fine. The CEO and the VP of the company have been removed and replaced. The scientist who led these investigations was actually arrested and charged,
Really?
which is incredibly unusual in this place, but in this space.
What was he charged with?
Well, with fraud. But the charges were dropped
Of
for
course.
technical reasons, and so that didn't end up playing out.
It's almost like that part was maybe for show.
Well, I don't know. I think it's hard to know, behind closed doors what's going on. But I assume that the people who were pursuing that, felt that they had a real case, or they wouldn't have brought it. But there were some technical issues with the case that prompted it to be dismissed. But I think that it's clearly been adjudicated now
Mm.
that this was a serious problem.
And so you discovered this, they went to phase 3 trials. At what point did that ball start to happen? Is you started releasing these papers and then it grew from there?
Well, we put this information out fairly rapidly because we wanted to prevent the phase 3 trials from starting. My point of view was that as a physician, that was an ethical
Yeah.
imperative.
And now we have human lives that are in this that we know could be misguided or no benefit.
Right. Right. And then I started working with an investigative reporter named Charlie Pillar, and we decided to describe this process publicly on the record under my name, because I felt that if the FDA was not going to intervene on the trials, we had an obligation of putting this out there in a bigger way with our professional credibility on the line, so that patients who were going to be involved in these trials at least had access to the information. And so that was the reasoning behind going on the record.
And how long did those trials happen before they were stopped?
A number of years. Yeah.
Wow. So during all of this bigger picture, you uncovered this 2006 paper. Can you explain the significance?
Yeah. So this happened in parallel. Like I was saying, that one of the thought processes that we were going through is that this is too easy, and how big of a problem is this? And I was also working on some analytical approaches. A lot of times you could show somebody something that looks manipulated. I could show you an image and say, see how this has been messed with.
Yeah.
And I think it might seem pretty convincing to you or me, but like to somebody who doesn't want to see it, it's easy for somebody to cross their arms and say, yeah, I just don't see it.
Yeah. Look at politics.
Right. And so
I don't believe it.
taking it from what seems obvious to what you can actually prove is actually a little bit of a challenge, and something that we spent some time working on.
Especially if the train of thought, the institution is already kind of locked into this.
There's some blinders on. There people would really rather not see that. They give the benefit of every doubt to the investigators, which may in some cases be appropriate, right? So I started looking at this investigator who had a similar set of problems, and his name was Sylvain Lesny. He was a French gentleman working at the University of Minnesota, and he was initially working under the supervision and tutelage of a very prominent scientist named Karen Ash. And collectively, they were working on the amyloid hypothesis in a slightly new way. So for the first decade or so of the amyloid hypothesis, the idea was that the plaques were the poison. And then there was a clinical trial around the year 2000 of vaccinating patients against the plaque, which was a really clever idea. You give people a vaccine, you activate the immune system to get in there and attack these plaques and remove it from the brain, and darn if it doesn't work in mice. Which is the story of this field, right? The number of times you're like, darn if it doesn't work in mice. When the clinical trial happened, the vaccination removed the plaques fine in people, but they didn't get better. And in fact, they developed some toxicity. It caused some inflammation of the brain. And so the trial had to be stopped prematurely because of this, what we call encephalitis, this swelling of the brain in a certain percentage of patients.
My stepfather had a case of that, and he got very confused. It happened all of a sudden. It's very serious.
Yeah, you don't want your brain to swell. There's no question about that. But this was a pretty big stumble for the amyloid hypothesis, because here you had a tool that actually moved beta amyloid, at least to a meaningful degree.
And it showed that even though it did that,
patients didn't get better. And again, it's a first experiment. You could argue about whether you could refine that, control the side effects, get higher doses, do lots of things. But I think it prompted a lot of people to ask, are we on the right track, right? This was the first time we saw I think, a really big challenge to the amyloid hypothesis. And so what happened was the amyloid hypothesis got reconfigured a little bit. And people started to say, well, maybe it's not the plaques themselves. So essentially, beta amyloid is this little microscopic noodle, and it likes to stick to itself. So it's really floppy when it's by itself. But as it sticks together and forms clumps, it gradually becomes more and more organized, and it becomes stiffer and more stable. And the thought was, perhaps in the process of forming these clumps in between one molecule of beta amyloid and millions of molecules in a plaque, maybe there is a clump that's small. That's the toxic form. Maybe it's still beta amyloid, but it's not the plaque. And that's where this idea called the oligomer comes from, the idea that a clump of a small number of these beta amyloid molecules may be the toxic component of the disease. And oligomer is just Greek for small clump, right? And so people started asking, okay, well, maybe if there's 2 molecules together, or 4, or 12, or a few dozen, maybe that's the form of beta amyloid. And we leave the big plaques alone, and we just target this silver bullet. And so there was an effort to identify the silver bullet.
Mm.
And that's what this paper did. So this was 2006, and Sylvain Lesney and Karen Ash claimed to have identified A beta star 56, which was an oligomer probably of 12 strands of beta amyloid, and they thought it was the silver bullet. They had a mouse model, and they showed that when that oligomer turned up in the brain, the mice developed symptoms. They started having trouble with their memory. And when they purified that and injected it into rats, the rats got memory problems, at least for a while, until they cleared the material. And so this was a blockbuster result at the time that sort of rescued and reconfigured the amyloid hypothesis. And there were other papers at the same time that boosted this idea, but this was one of the big players. This was cited thousands of times. It's in the patents and in the big review articles that people were leveraging to argue that you should still be targeting beta amyloid, but maybe a very specific form of it. We found that there were problems in this paper. And in fact, we found that there were problems in almost every figure in this paper, that there were lots and lots of areas where we found cut and paste type changes, where somebody would make a blot. Essentially, we would run an experiment where we would look at how much of a protein was in a sample based on a black smudge on a what we call a membrane, or a Western blot. And how black that smudge is tells us how much of the membrane is there. And we found that there were areas where those things seemed to have been moved around. There was cloning, tools that, things that could easily be done with the tools in Photoshop.
So this was intentional forgery.
Sure, it looked like it. We are always very careful with those sorts of words, because you have to understand the whole process, and there has to be due process, before you make those sorts of allegations, because you don't know who's done what or what the motivations are. But it certainly looked bad, right? These were things that, whatever they were clearly not right.
It's not a natural anomaly. Like this didn't just happen.
And we had developed a set of tools to really quantify those relationships, so that we could certainly prove that, components we were looking at were clones. So for instance, when you build this Western blot, sometimes it's actually the noise in the background that's more important, right? It's like when you're looking at an AI generated image, maybe it's not the central part of the image that tells you that this thing has been fiddled with. It's that the clouds aren't right in the background or something of that nature. And so we focus a lot on the background. Mm-hmm. And in the background of 2 of the Western blots were little teeny tiny air bubbles, little teeny white dots that were scattered. And in another figure, we found another blot that looked very different, but the air bubbles were in exactly the same spots. And when you see 15 of those things align, you know that these have to be from the same source, right? And then you can start to statistically say, what's the probability of aligning 15 little air bubbles? Yeah. And it turns out it's a very, very small number.
And this is in 2022 is when you started discovering this. Where were you, first of all? Were you in your office when you started to see these initially, or walk me through that?
Well, I had started throwing these things in files. I had been finding huge volumes of this material, and not just in these people's work, in a lot of different people's work. But this particular individual, the volume of problems got to a pretty high level. And so I had been communicating with the NIH about the Cassava Sciences mess. And at the end of that, I had tagged on this additional dossier on this Sylvain Lesné, and I basically told the folks at the NIH, "Hey, this has nothing to do with cassava sciences, but I'm aware of it, and it's too big, for me to just let this go. So I'm forwarding this too, but it's unrelated to this other thing that we've been working on." And at the time, I had been talking with Charles Pillar, who's this investigative reporter I mentioned that I worked with. And I had shared with him some of the communications I had had with the NIH, and he saw that reference and said, "Hey, can I see that dossier?" And I think that he was the one who looked at this and said, maybe there's a bigger story here than you think. I think I was aware that these were prominent papers and that this was, a big issue.
But you were maybe looking at them more clinical at that point,
Yeah,
just
I was looking at them from a more technical point of view, and I
okay.
think sitting down and seeing that body of work collectively and how much influence it had, I think we discovered together, in the process of reviewing that probably that was a bigger story than I had initially thought.
Whenever it started to become clear, do you remember how that made you feel? Were you angry or were you just wanted to solve this
Well,
or
initially, it was sort of a puzzle. I think initially it was just trying to figure out what had happened. I don't think that it was something I had, major feelings about. But I certainly think that the deeper we went into understanding it, the more frustrating it became. And I think that I spoke with collaborators of these people and people that we knew that were colleagues in common. And I was surprised how little traction and how little support we could get. I wasn't surprised that the primary players, didn't want to do anything. But the
right.
fact that co-authors who had, huge track records in this field and had produced a lot of good work were willing to sit by quietly, that was pretty astonishing. And
And
I
do you
think,
think they knew?
well, they knew because I told them.
And they did once you told them they didn't take any
Well, I
action?
don't know what they did,
Oh,
but
okay.
there wasn't obvious public, steps taken.
Wow.
Again, these universities can be very opaque, and so it can be hard to know exactly what has been done, and people may well take steps within the system that are not obvious, I don't know.
So, I guess to backtrack, roughly how much money is spent every year on Alzheimer's research?
Or you'll have to
ChatGPT.
define your terms a little bit because at the NIH, it's quite a large number. It's a fair number of billions of dollars, but the private sector, um, is spending more than that.
So
I
we can say in the billions annually.
easy, yeah.
Okay, so billions annually towards this problem. This happened in 2006. How are you the first person in almost a 20-year time span to see this and blow the whistle on it?
Well, I don't know if you've seen these brain teaser type puzzles where somebody gives you a smudge and says, "What do you see?" Right? And you don't see anything, and then somebody tells you, "Oh, well, it's a duck." And then after that, you can't not see it. And I think some of it is that. I think that people aren't asking that question. I think people generally in this business trust each other.
And you were already going down this rabbit hole of potential fraud with this drug, so
And
your
I'm
mind
progressively becoming more and more skeptical about the field. I think I probably would have started in a similar spot, that these types of problems are ultra rare. And I think it took some time to get my head around the notion that they're not rare, that this is actually a significant problem for our field.
and so for your field, you're saying Alzheimer's research specifically or
Yeah,
neurology?
neuroscience. Yeah.
Science. So this picture starts to become clear. There were copy and pasted, manipulated images. And I guess images aside, were there also just blatant lies or forged writings? What else was there?
Well, when you look at somebody's and I mean, what I typically do once you see something of this nature is we look at everything somebody's done for a couple of reasons. One is it puts some detail to this. It helps you understand the arc of the problem. It helps make sure you're looking at the right person, make sure that there's a pattern that tracks over time. But it's also a very collaborative discipline, and you can have a lot of collateral damage. You can do a lot of reputational harm to collaborators that you really want to try not to do. And so that's one of the reasons we look at an entire CV is it helps to exonerate collaborators and do less collateral damage. And so that's what we did. And essentially what we found is that throughout this person's work, from their graduate work before they joined this lab to the work that they did as a postdoc in this lab to their independent work, was all corrupted in a similar way. It was a prolific pattern of manipulation.
And was he a doctor or a
He was a
PhD?
PhD. Yeah.
So what did he have to gain from doing that?
Well,
Sylvain Les
Mhm. Sylvain Lesné, and I mean, I think he got a position out of it. The Nature paper often makes a person's career. It's a really good way to launch, your career. And he got grants, he got social status from it. I think that in this space, he got a lot from that maneuver.
Is he still in the public sphere in good graces or
He's not. He's been removed from his position now, but it took a long time. It
Yeah.
took a couple of years to get that paper retracted. And in fact, um, Nature put an expression of concern on it. So they did acknowledge fairly quickly that there were that concerns had been raised and that they were investigating, but they didn't retract that paper until Karen Ash eventually decided that the issues were too severe and agreed to retract that paper. Took years.
And so I just want people to grasp the significance of this. That 2006 paper, would you consider that the cornerstone of kind of Alzheimer's thought for 20 years? What is the significance that
It,
he got this paper out?
it's I think that people will tell you quite accurately that no hypothesis, very rarely would a hypothesis hinge on one paper.
Right.
And that's fair. I think that there were other very important papers in this space that supported the idea. But this paper was important not just for what they found, but also how it was used. Right. So when we brought these concerns out, we heard from so many scientists that they attempted to reproduce that result and couldn't reproduce various components of it. And some people even doubted if A beta star 56 existed. And I think in retrospect, it's probably likely that it didn't. And yet, the paper continued to be cited.
Even whenever they couldn't recreate
That's
it.
right. By some of the same people who said that they couldn't reproduce it, continued to cite the paper because it fit in a very useful niche, right? And that's the problem with fraudulent data, right? Is that it's not that it's massively abundant, right? It's still, a small portion of what's out there. But if you can custom deliver a result to fit a space, right, you can land it into nodes in people's thinking that can warp the field. And I think that's what happened. This idea was already enucleated in this field. The idea that an oligomer might drive the disease progression. And this paper came along and amplified that story. Basically said, here it is, gave it energy. And even when the wind came out of the sails of this paper and people couldn't reproduce it in the details, the principle of the paper continued to be useful in justifying this approach to the disease.
And now as it develops, people are believing it just grows on itself and people don't realize that's where
Right. So I think it may be a slight overstatement to call it the cornerstone, but it was a very influential part of this story. And when you combine it with the failed clinical trials, it's very hard to ignore that this field has been off track for a long time.
So you initially blew the whistle 2022.
Mhm.
So a paper was released in 2006, published in Nature. When did they finally withdraw that?
It was a couple years later. It was 2 years later.
After 2022.
Mhm.
So
Took a long time.
2024
And in fact, the NIH gave Sylvain Lesné another large grant after this story came out.
for Alzheimer's research.
Mhm. Well, for neurodegeneration research, it might have been related to Parkinson's. I don't recall, but
Why
yeah.
would they do that?
Well, I think I don't know. I think it's
If you had to speculate.
very slow process and I think under-resourced process to deal with fraudulent data. The field is just not equipped to do that. When you look at HHS's Office of Research Integrity, it's a pretty small office. And when you look at the total number of cases that they're clearing with a judgment of misconduct a year, it's almost always in the single digits. 3, 4, 5 cases a year is very typical. And that just isn't representative of the scale of the problem, not within our one field, let alone all of science.
So 3 or 4 a year, what do you think that scale is of what should be processed a year?
Hundreds.
Wow. So the NIH knew about Lesney's fraudulent work after it was acknowledged and confirmed and
Right.
gave him the
So,
grant.
Charlie Piller wrote an investigative reporting piece describing what we had found and, talking to the individuals involved in Science Magazine in 2022. And that got an enormous amount of traction. It made the front page of some newspapers in London and was covered in Le Monde basically every big US newspaper and was on TV. And so, I mean, it sort of got a fair amount of traction for a period of time. But the actual regulatory components of this took a very long time to progress. And really, a lot of the progress happened only when the key players decided that that they were going to cooperate. It wasn't until Karen Ash supported the
And who is Karen
retraction. She
Ash?
was the senior author. She was Sylvain Lesney's boss and the senior author on the paper.
So not until one of the authors of the paper agreed to retract it, was it?
Correct.
Holy shit.
Yeah.
So what is your view of the NIH now?
Well, so I think you've got a systematic problem. I think nobody wants to deal with these problems. No one wants to acknowledge that there are these problems. I think that the idea that scientists are above reproach and better than other people is pretty deeply ingrained in this business. But it turns out scientists are people.
Hmm.
And the Garden of Eden really happened, and it happened to us too. And so my impression is that these organizations are pretty naive and that we're ending up squandering a lot of resources because we're just not engaging with this problem,
Hmm.
right? It's just not realistic in a complicated human endeavor like science that you're not going to have fraud, right? That's not a reasonable objective.
Right.
But to have a system that recognizes it's out there and can effectively deal with it is something that really needs to be put in place.
Do you think any meaningful change will ever happen to these institutions?
I hope so. And what I tell my colleagues is, look, if we don't take steps to fix this, and that can happen at a lot of levels, but somebody will impose fixes on us, and those fixes will probably be pretty blunt,
Hmm.
right? If you want politicians to come in and tell scientists that they have to answer to the scientific police, then we should keep doing what we're doing.
Mhm.
But I don't think anybody in our business wants there to be scientific police going around, which means that we have to, as a field, figure out how we're going to handle this. And I think it starts with scientists, the people who are co-authors on papers being willing to say, I'm not allowing my reputation to be used in this way. When you become aware of a problem, that you make the quality of the data that you're endorsing the preeminent concern above your relationships with people, above everything else.
Mhm.
And I think that's where it starts. And I think institutions need to do the same thing. I think the NIH needs to put some teeth behind enforcement. HHS needs to put some teeth behind enforcement. And truthfully, I think if it's done thoughtfully, wisely, it's very likely to pay for itself.
So I just started this book. I'm not too deep into it yet, but it's Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s book, The Real Anthony Fauci.
Hmm.
Do you have a take on that world? Because he's more in the vaccine lane and the dietitian lane. Do you think there's validity to his arguments on some of these things based on your knowledge of how these institutions operate now?
Yeah, so I've not read this book. I'm certainly aware of some of the controversies in this space. And what I'll say is that I think, I've often seen these administrative figures as being very distant. And then when you get to know somebody in person, often my view evolves. You realize that people are really trying to do their best. And so I don't know exactly, in that context, what the motivations were or where the problems were. I think in the Alzheimer's space, the NIH is extremely bureaucratic.
Mm.
I think that in one of our later cases, we worked on a clinical trial for stroke. And we had found that similar to the cassava sciences, the preclinical data had been manipulated for a different drug that was being used for stroke. And in that case, an administrator at the NIH was took very rapid action to stop that clinical trial. And so it's also not monolithic.
It's just dependent.
I think that you've got some good people who are willing to put their reputation on the line and act courageously, and I think you got some people who are not.
Mm.
And I think also you've got a bureaucratic system that may not allow people to act in some cases. And so I think what needs to happen is that people who deeply understand these institutions need to reform them, or you're going to see more blunt actions that are going to cause some unacceptable side effects. We're going to see that the funding levels are going to be cut because that's what Congress can do. And so I think that if we don't act responsibly and if we don't figure out how to make these systems, function, we should not be surprised that we don't like the fallout.
So this is kind of an off topic. Did you ever meet Anthony Fauci or
No,
have
I never
anything?
have.
No. Okay.
Yeah.
It's probably for the best.
Have you met him?
No, I have
Oh,
not.
okay. No,
I'd
I
have a
don't. I
few
don't know
choice
him at
words
all.
to say to him if I ever did.
Yeah. No, I've never met him at all.
Um, so before we move on, so do you feel like, and I am just an outsider doing my best trying to perceive all of this, the research, the trials, this whole kind of ecosystem, do you feel like NIH giving these grants, this whole system has kind of incentivized people to not step out of any kind of mainstream thought process to get funding to
Yes.
further their career and their team?
I have to say, anyone who's interacted with the NIH understands that it's a really risk-averse institution. They tend to fund fairly predictable research, and I think that we maybe need to encourage scientists to take more risks. I think we need to not necessarily be so quick to laugh at people who buck existing ideas. I think that creating um, a marketplace where ideas have a little bit of oxygen, have a little bit of breathing room, is important. And honestly, I think that foundations and investors and philanthropists can have a major effect in this space. When you see a philanthropist give money to research, that has an outsized influence to the sheer dollar value. When you compare what the average philanthropist contributes to our work, it's relatively small compared to the grants that we have. But what we're able to do is dramatically different because there's no strings on it, right? We can move a lot faster. We can move in less bureaucratic ways. We can tackle problems that would be extremely hard to get a grant to fund. And so I think that supporting this, both from the private sector, but also I think from federal funds and encouraging people to take risks is something that needs to happen. And it may mean that we need to, instead of funding projects, we need to fund scientists. We need to identify people who are doing good work and say, okay, look, let's take some of the pressure off. Let's not have people fighting for their life every couple of years and at risk of losing their jobs in their labs every time a grant lapses.
Mm.
Maybe we need to add some stability to the process and take people who are doing really good work and fund them, so that they're free to take more risks and to push the envelope a little bit.
That makes sense. So whenever all this came out, you were in a junior level position in your career. I'm guessing you were a voice against the grain for the large part in your community.
I think that's probably a fair characterization.
So, what was that like? Kind of taking a counterpoint to an entire institution, entire narrative. What impact did that have on you after you released this and you became a public, outspoken figure on this?
Yeah. It was a little bit nerve-wracking. I won't lie about that. But, I'm a physician scientist, and I think, doctoring is very meaningful. Being a physician is an important job. And I always thought if things went horribly wrong and they took the lab away from me, I'd be perfectly comfortable and happy being a doctor out in the countryside somewhere, that's not a compromise, that is a hugely meaningful role. And I think that creates some stability, right? That gives you, the confidence that really helps.
And you knew that you were doing this for the right reason.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that I didn't view this as optional, right? I mean, everybody asked, when did you decide to do this? I didn't, right? I don't think there was ever an option, right? When thousands of patients are going to enroll in a clinical trial, I don't think most physicians can get their mind around not talking there. I think that most physicians put in the same position would make the same decision. You can't see that happen to patients and not give them every chance to know what they're getting into.
So in 2022 since, have there been attacks on you or just pushback against you or hit
Yeah, I
pieces?
mean, some. I think that there has been no shortage of criticism, and that's fine, right? We expect it to be a vigorous marketplace of ideas, and so
Mhm.
these ideas are perfectly valid to criticize. There have been a handful of threats, and there some issues, but I think generally, there's also been quite a lot of support.
Mm,
There have been a lot of people who've come out of the woodworks to say, it's important that we're able to have these conversations, and so it's mixed, and
mhm.
and that's okay. I think there's as much positive feedback as I could have hoped for.
Good.
And it's not that there aren't some worries, and I don't know how stable, my position is even at this point. But
Why do you say that?
you just do the next thing. You keep doing the experiments, you keep working, and like I said, if I end up being a neurologist in the countryside somewhere, I'm very comfortable with that.
And do you say that because a lot of that relies on the favor of these institutions?
Well, yeah, that's right. I mean, you have to keep the lab funded, right? It
Yeah.
doesn't it doesn't it doesn't keep going on its own. And if you can't convince a large pool of your peers to all vote positively for your work, you don't get funded.
So do you feel like the last 22 years of Alzheimer's research was lost in the wrong direction?
We lost some things. It wasn't all a loss. There's been some progress along the way. I think that the most tangible progress is in diagnostics. 22 years ago, we would have told you that Alzheimer's disease, you needed an autopsy to diagnose it. And it turns out that's pretty impractical. That's not a good way of diagnosing things. Um, and there has been a huge amount of development in diagnostics. A group out of Pittsburgh worked to develop a PET scan specifically for Alzheimer's disease, and this has been a dramatic change in what we're doing. And it also has improved our clinical trials dramatically, that we actually understand the biology of the patients that we're studying. Prior to being able to accurately diagnose Alzheimer's disease, there's a lot of noise in the clinical trials. And so even if those interventions worked, there might have been enough noise to wash out the signal. It might have been that we weren't able to detect it because we didn't, we had patients in those trials who didn't have Alzheimer's disease, a lot of patients in those trials who didn't have Alzheimer's disease. So the PET scans and the cerebrospinal fluid markers were a dramatic improvement. And then in just the last couple of years, there have been some blood tests that have come out, which actually look like they're performing pretty well. I think we're still getting used to them, and I think we should be cautious with how we're using them. But there are some blood tests that are now on the market, and I think will redefine again how we diagnose this disease. And so,
How are those used?
well, so they're detecting a little fragment of tau, which is a part of the protein that forms the tangles, the part within neurons. And they've shown that that the elevations of this marker predict the presence of beta amyloid in the brain, even in some cases before symptoms emerge.
And now would you advise someone, so like in the to be proactive with their health, maybe after you hit 35 or 40, like an annual blood test of this?
Well, I don't know. At the moment, we're not recommending that. These are relatively new tests, and for the moment, we've really only shown validity in patients who have the beginning symptoms.
Mhm.
But you don't know. It might get to that stage where we have enough data to understand what it predicts. At the moment, we're telling patients, and I think fairly so, that in the absence of symptoms, you need to be really, really cautious about how you interpret this blood test,
Mhm.
and maybe even discourage people from getting it. But it's early days, and we are likely to see a lot of growth in our understanding of how to use this test and what causes false positives and false negatives, and so I think we'll see this evolve a little bit.
I have a note on here. Maybe you can tell me more about it. So, a medication, Aduhelm?
Mhm.
Aduhelm? Can you tell me about
So
that?
aducanumab is the generic name for this drug, and it's essentially an antibody against beta amyloid. And so this was the drug that I had been talking about to the media before the cassava sciences stuff came
Against.
along. And essentially, this is trying to mimic what the vaccine did. Remember, we talked about the vaccine experiment where we vaccinated patients against beta amyloid, and it caused swelling in the brain in some patients. Well, the next thought was, okay, perhaps if we control that reaction, instead of having your body make the antibody, what if we just give people the antibody specifically at the right target, specific controlled quantities? Maybe we can have some better success, better safety. And for the next decade and a half or so, either the antibodies would not be very effective or they removed beta amyloid, but they caused the swelling. And so we had this problem of a lot of failed trials of these antibodies. Aducanumab was the first one that managed to get approved. And it was extremely controversial. Essentially, what happened is Biogen ran 2 parallel clinical trials, and they were stopped early for futility, meaning a statistician looked at the data and said, there's no way this works out. We just need to stop. And then when they analyzed the full data set retrospectively, they said, wait, we missed a signal. And they went back and made the case that even though they stopped for futility, that there was some, minor signal of efficacy that they had overlooked. And essentially, one of the clinical trials didn't look too bad. The other one looked very, very neutral.
And so is this, sorry to interrupt, is this the drug company reviewing their own trial?
Correct. But they, they're making this case to the FDA. And so the FDA ultimately has to decide if they agree or not. And the FDA ultimately decides to give them a conditional, essentially, approval on the basis that the antibody removed beta amyloid. But of course, removing beta amyloid isn't what you or I want. Mm-hmm. What we want is our memories to work better.
Right.
And the drug just didn't do that. And so it was very, very controversial. And the scientific advisory board voted overwhelmingly against approving it.
10-0, right?
And when they did approve it, a number of those people resigned in protest over the decision. And so this, I think, was a very controversial moment in our field.
And what year was this?
This would have been 2021 or around that time frame. And then Biogen, in partnership with a company called Eisai, introduced lecanemab, which is essentially a second generation of aducanumab, which looked nominally better. It had a cleaner clinical trial. It didn't have the stutter step with the stopped trial. And they eventually pulled aducanumab from the market. So it's not on the market anymore, but its partner drug, lecanemab, is. And essentially, lecanemab very slightly slowed the progression of memory symptoms, but it's incredibly small effect. But statistically was provable that it had a bit of an effect and was introduced to the market. And essentially, when we check patients' memory on a screening test in the office, we ask them 30 questions, and they're questions like, do you know what day it is and what month it is and what time of the day it is? And can you spell this word? And can you remember these sets of words? That sort of thing. And the difference for patients treated with lecanemab for 18 months was less than 1/2 of one question. And so we're talking about a very, very small effect.
And so what's the impact of getting this drug and its predecessor that had, on an independent advisory committee, they voted 10-0 against approving it. The FDA still approved it anyways. Mm-hmm. What impact did that have on the patient population? What negative impacts did that have? Just false hope? Or?
I think that these drugs also had pretty significant safety concerns, right? And so like the vaccines, they can cause some swelling in the brain. And we actually saw that a lot. We saw that in somewhere between 25 and 40% of patients. And in the majority of them, in a large majority of them, the areas of swelling were pretty minor. They were very small and they would tend to go away. But in a few patients, it was pretty substantial swelling. And even in a handful of cases has been fatal. And so this is always a matter, an issue in medicine that you're interested in risks versus benefits, right? And if you could get that trivial benefit to somebody's memory by giving them a vitamin, that would be a perfectly reasonable thing to do. But probably you shouldn't take a major risk with somebody's health for a benefit that's that small. And so that's the argument that I've been making with these 2 drugs. There is a competing drug on the market as well called donanemab, is that they have some marginal benefit. But they don't conclusively change the course of the disease, and the safety risks, to me, outweigh any of the benefits.
So compared to a lower risk profile, vitamins, lifestyle, things that you could do,
right?
Compared to this potentially dangerous drug.
Right. No, that's absolutely right. That the drug doesn't to me justify the risks that patients experience.
So the FDA, they have an accelerated approval
Mhm.
pathway. Do you feel like drug companies are taking or pharmaceutical companies are taking advantage of that pathway to push things through?
Well, pharmaceutical companies are doing what they do, right? I
Right.
mean, they're following the rules in a system to try to make money and to try to bring products to the market that the market wants. And so, we would all be very excited to have a game-changing drug in this space, and we would want it to be on the market as soon as possible, were that to happen. And so it's one of those things where you don't want to dismiss the underlying motivations
Right.
here, right? That we definitely need development in this space, but we also need to be cautious. I think some people think you can't make a situation worse,
Hmm.
but I promise you, you can make this situation worse. And so we have to, we have to respect patients in the early stages of this disease. They have meaningful quality of life. They still have something to contribute, and we shouldn't flippantly disregard that. That patients, should only be subjected to these trials if they have a meaningful chance of benefiting.
And I can imagine in these big institutional considerations, these research trials, this funding, drug companies, people can start to become looked at like numbers or data or things to make.
That's probably true. It
Yeah.
probably can happen that way. And I do think that keeping your eye on the humanity of what you're doing is important. I tell patients when I talk to them about whether or not to participate in a clinical trial, that this isn't doctoring, right? That this is science. This is an experiment, right?
Mm.
Nobody's taking an oath in this context to do no harm.
So you're signing up for an experiment.
You're signing up for an experiment, and it's important. This is how we move the field forward, and maybe you'll benefit. Maybe you'll be the first person who gets to experience the benefits of a new drug, but also perhaps you'll be the one who experiences toxicity from these drugs.
And I
And so
guess
we have to be really honest with patients that we're
yeah.
doing the best we can, but in this context, there's a lot we don't know.
And I guess with Alzheimer's, unlike maybe cancer or other realms, there's not a lot of alternatives, so people might be more open to do these trials.
Yeah, I think that desperation can be something that people take advantage of. Yeah, I think you're right that this is um, not an easy disease to live with. And I think that sometimes people are willing to sign up for things, and we've seen, in the supplement market, and we've seen in phony stem cell transplants and things that people have definitely taken advantage of patients who are in a desperate condition in this space. And so I think that it's a physician, important role for physicians to help patients navigate that.
So now with all of this that you've uncovered, and from your standpoint as a vascular neurologist, and I know we've touched on it, but to summarize it, if you think this amyloid theory is not the driver, what is your best guess right now as to what's causing Alzheimer's?
I think that fundamentally the brain's ability to control its waste products is being undermined. I think that the brain has become less efficient at getting rid of waste
And is
products.
this because of lifestyle choices or just aging?
Well, I think aging is probably what's bringing this to the surface, but other things are clearly contributing. This is more than just aging. But obviously, when you look at the risk factors for Alzheimer's disease, the most profound one is aging. We don't see this in young people. Even the genetic forms of the disease that are so aggressive, we're not seeing them in very young people. And so this, aging is an important factor here, probably the most important factor. But I think fundamentally, the waste products get out of the brain through a few pathways. And one of them is through the blood vessels, right? The brain doesn't have a lymphatic system. And the rest of your body, the material that is, the waste products from your cells goes into the space in between the cells. And all of that fluid collects as lymph and is cleared through your lymphatic channels and eventually put back into your blood supply to be cleared out. And the brain doesn't have a classical lymphatic system, but we're starting to understand how those waste products get out of the brain, and they interact with the blood vessels to do that. You need healthy blood vessels to allow that fluid to escape the brain. And as you damage your blood vessels through whatever, through genetics, through hypertension, through exposure to pollutants, through whatever, that becomes less efficient over time. And that's where what I think is driving the accumulation of beta amyloid in the blood vessels. And it's likely that beta amyloid is not the only waste product that we're seeing. I think that tau is a waste product. I think a lot of inflammatory molecules are also being driven by the accumulation of these waste products.
S- So, as a practicing physician, you see patients with Alzheimer's, dementia. Do you see often, say, patients 65 and above who are healthy, go to the gym, they run, eat clean? Do those patients still get Alzheimer's?
Yeah, sadly, sometimes they do. And I think that that's part of the complexity of this is that it defies really simple explanations. A pretty big chunk of your risk of developing Alzheimer's is genetic. It's encoded across, dozens, probably hundreds of genes. And so that's a factor that you probably can't do anything about, at least not, easily. Um, but lifestyle things also do move the needle. And so in the same way, you'll meet somebody who lives to 100 and has smoked every day of their life, while other people who have never smoked get lung cancer at 40, statistically, that's not how things play out. And we can see statistically that healthier lifestyles are definitely a component
Mm.
of protecting from this disease. And so I think
Would you
really
say those people that are healthier are fewer that walk into your office? Or it really is just kind of
yeah, I see a real mix of people, and I think it can also affect how old you are when you experience this disease. And so, I think I see a lot of people in their 80s and 90s, and by the time you get to your 90s, a pretty substantial percentage of patients, have Alzheimer's disease.
are there any other theories or big schools of thoughts that you're following right now that might be promising to explain this?
I think that the things that I would be looking at now that are ready for prime time sort of flow from that central idea of going from the notion that there's one domino, which is amyloid,
Mm.
that drives everything, to the notion that there's a lot of factors feeding into this that compromises the waste disposal systems in the brain. And so we see a lot of the other theories around this disease fit into that matrix very nicely.
Mm.
And so one of the leading ones is that you have smoldering low levels of inflammation in the brain, and that if you could tackle neuroinflammation, that you might be able to slow the disease down. I think there's some potential in those pathways.
And that could be caused by drinking, sleep deprivation, all sorts of
We
things.
certainly see that sleep deprivation is a factor, alcohol exposure is a factor, traumatic brain injury is a factor. And again, a lot of these things can provoke injury directly, but they can also damage the vasculature and may over time cause accumulation of waste products that in turn drive inflammation. But we're talking about sort of smoldering levels, not the encephalitis levels of inflammation that we talked about earlier, things that are not obvious in a minute to minute scenario, but that over the course of years can take a toll on the brain. And so I think these neuroinflammatory pathways could be a very tractable place to see new treatments emerge. The truth is, I don't think that the scenario is that bleak. I think that this is how we make progress. You look at these other neurological diseases that are moving, you've got to believe in the potential,
Mm.
right? That we are understanding how the brain functions. We're able to get traction on other really difficult diseases in this space. And I think it's coming, right?
Yeah.
But I think that we've got to at some point acknowledge reality and move the field on to the next thing so that we can make progress. And some of that is doing the boring basic work like controlling your blood pressure that
Mm.
we already know moves the needle.
Right. So these healthy lifestyle factors do move the needle.
They do.
And then if you can optimize all of those at that point where we're at right now, it is just luck of the draw.
There's some of that, right? There's absolutely we're not able to get control of all of the factors that are driving this disease at the moment. But, that's true for a lot of
Yeah.
diseases. And we focus on what we call modifiable risk factors, the ones that you have some control over, because that's how you can make progress.
So speaking on that, what are the modifiable risk factors for Alzheimer's that you would tell a
The
patient?
single biggest one that I really have been advocating for people to pay more attention to is high blood pressure, right? That it's easy to ignore. It's easy for people to say, yeah, my blood pressure is good. And you're walking around at 130 or 140. We're used to thinking of these really radically elevated blood pressure numbers as being the problem. But actually walking around with a little bit elevated blood pressure for 30 or 40 years takes a big toll. And not just on your brain, but on your carotid arteries, on your heart, on your other organs as well. And so, a number of years ago, a clinical trial was done called the Sprint Minds trial that looked at whether aggressive blood pressure control moved the needle. And it does. It's
Mm.
like the only bright spot in the clinical trial literature, in the clinical trial landscape, is this blood pressure
Mm.
trial. And the trouble is, like, it doesn't get people excited, right? You
Yeah.
don't have big patents and huge marketing campaigns around buying a blood pressure monitor and being careful with your drugs. But
Mm.
here's the thing. If you want people to eat better, you want people to quit smoking, you're fighting some addiction biology. Those things are hard, right? They're important, but they're hard. Blood pressure control, there's no addiction biology there. As soon as people realize that they can buy a $20 blood pressure cuff and dial in their blood pressure themselves, within a Nazi, or really understand your day-to-day fluctuations, what a good day and a bad day looks like, and dial your blood pressure into an ideal spot and reduce your risk of heart attacks, reduce your risk of strokes, and reduce your risk of Alzheimer's disease. We'd be dancing in the streets if we had a drug that did that, and we do. It doesn't outright fix the problem, but it's a factor that is 100% controllable that anybody can go out and take control over.
And that compounded from, say, 25 to 60 is what causes it.
Right, and it's interesting because the Sprint Minds trial showed that it didn't move the needle in patients who already had Alzheimer's disease. You had to have pretty early symptoms to see the benefit, and it says once the cows are out of the barn, there may not be as much we can do. So you have to start proactively. But the truth is, your cardiologist is telling you the same thing, right? And we see this for stroke as well. You treat a lot of patients with stroke. There's a couple of different trials or studies that have been done that have looked at stroke risk factors across the world. Bill Gates funded one of them, and there's another called the Interstroke study. And both of these studies looked at people from every continent on Earth except Antarctica. And what they showed is that high blood pressure was the single biggest factor for both hemorrhagic stroke and ischemic stroke in every demographic, men, women, every race, every socioeconomic class. And in the one that Bill Gates founded, they actually had to put it in its own color because it was a bigger risk factor than anything else. Nothing else came close. And we already know how to fix this, right? And so it's one of those things that, like, it doesn't drive drug development. It doesn't, make shareholders excited.
It's not sexy.
But
There's no
as
billions.
a doctor, like, you can get started, right? It's not the fix, but it moves the needle, and you can do it today.
So if you were telling, say, a patient in your office how to lower their blood pressure to lower their risk for Alzheimer's.
Yep. First thing I tell them is get a blood pressure cuff and check every day, just like you're doing. You're brushing your teeth. We check resting blood pressures once a day, and you'd be surprised what people learn. Right? People who thought their blood pressure was perfect realize that maybe it runs a little bit high, maybe there are spikes, maybe sometimes they have really bad days and their blood pressure goes through the roof. Who knows? But it can be surprisingly informative. And then we can dial in their drug regimen. People often think, oh, blood pressure medications are going to make me feel lousy. But the newer regimens are actually patients feel pretty good on them. There are combo pills now that can keep the number of drugs you have to take to a minimum. So there are a lot of improvements in this space for just how patients experience this.
Now, do you, because I know of myself, I am fluctuating with high blood pressure. Do you feel like lifestyle factors, whether that's sauna, diet, running, cardio, those things can lower blood pressure on their own?
Definitely.
And there's some patients that also need medication.
100%. Both of those things. Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of patients who are borderline and can make some progress with lifestyle modifications. And if you're actively checking your numbers, you can see that happen in real time and know if it's working or not.
So if somebody's monitoring it, and say they're running 135 over 80, just slightly elevated or elevated, how long should they try to change their lifestyle habits before they say, okay, it's time to introduce some medication?
Yeah, it depends on how old you are, and it depends on how out of whack the numbers are. I think the more severe the numbers, the more likely you are to need medications. And also you have to be realistic about how disciplined you are about your lifestyle modifications, right? And but a lot of blood pressure is genetically encoded, right? Some of it is lifestyle for sure, but some of this is just how you're wired. And so I think the answer may be both. But if you're engaged and you're looking at those numbers, consistently over time, you'll know.
That's the first step, is being aware of it. Just
being aware. And knowing you don't need permission for this, right? You can go get a blood pressure cuff from Walgreens. They're really good now, by the way. They're pretty reliable, especially the ones that come up on your upper arm.
I've got one.
And, anybody can do this, and it moves the needle.
So you're working with the Vanderbilt Memory and Alzheimer's Center? So what is your role there, and what have you discovered so far in terms of prevention, treatment? What's the work being done?
So I'm running a research laboratory adjacent to this program, and so I work on a lot of basic science topics, trying to understand why blood vessels fall apart. The centerpiece of that program is an observational study for patients who Some of them have cognitive symptoms. A lot of people, before they have cognitive symptoms, have enrolled to try to study what cognition looks like across the aging spectrum and how blood vessel problems can contribute to changes in cognitive aging. And so those patients get scans, they get MRIs, they get a bunch of blood work and cerebrospinal fluid analyses. And I think the hope is to over time, understand what predicts
Mm.
cognitive trajectories, both from a risk factor standpoint, but also from some biochemistry. It'd be nice to find some markers. And so it's a very large scale project that's collaborating with other Alzheimer's disease research centers across the country.
So, saying if money is no object, say I'm a billionaire, what age would you recommend to start doing these preemptive tests to then be able to modify lifestyle or drug factors? And what does that look like? Does that look like yearly PET scans, blood test? Like, if I'm money's no object, I'm running the gamut.
Yeah, I'm not sure any of that helps at this point. You know what helps is getting healthy, right?
Mm.
The things that are good for your heart and good for your blood vessels are good for your brain.
Do the
That's
things
what
that
we
we
know,
know.
right? And what I would say is invest in making your diet as good as you can make it your diet, get your body as healthy as you can make your body, avoid obvious pollutants that can cause problems like smoking, like secondhand smoke. Try to get your environment as clean as you can make it. Those are things that clearly matter. Watch your sleep quality. I think making sure that you're sleeping well, that you're not letting things like sleep apnea creep in, which can interfere.
Do you think that everyone should get at least 7 hours, 8 hours? Is there a number
Well,
for?
no, I think it's different for different people, but you want high quality
Okay.
sleep, right? I think that you want to make sure that you're not just getting a certain amount of sleep, but that it's not getting interrupted by, again, things
Mm.
like sleep apnea, which can be underappreciated factors.
Yeah, and I've been wearing one of these whoops for years now, and it's probably the best thing I bought to monitor the depth of sleep, to just like tracking blood pressure. If I'm starting to track these numbers, I can see a baseline. I'm more focused on improving it.
Yeah. Well, I will say that it is one of those things that we pay attention to when patients come in, especially if they're a little young for Alzheimer's disease and feel like their memory isn't right. One of the first things that we check is, do you have sleep apnea?
Mhm.
Because if you're waking up a couple hundred times a night, you're not going to feel good in the morning.
Right. So before we move into a few questions, I saw something about a lysome storage problem.
Mm.
Is that something?
So my lab has worked on two big waste disposal pathways in the brain, how you get waste products out of the brain. And one of them is the blood vessels. And we talked about how the fluid waste from cells moves out of the brain and eventually crosses through the blood vessels. The other way you could get rid of waste is for the cell itself to break it down. And it does that through a little tiny organelle called the lysosome, which, if you remember biology class, is the most boring of the organelles. It's just basically a little tiny circle floating around the cell. But inside that circle is a vat of acid that breaks things down. And it's actually turned out to be, I think, a really underappreciated organelle. It's important for how the cell recycles things. It's able to break down old components of the cell, old proteins, and allow the body to have, or the cell to have, building blocks to build new things. And so that was the other line of work that my lab has been pursuing, but with the same basic idea that we need to be paying attention to how the brain gets rid of its waste products, whether it's breaking it down within the brain or secreting it into the fluid and clearing it out of the brain, that these are the processes that seem to be going awry.
And so now, to improve, say, with being as healthy as possible, making sure your circulation system is primed to be able to clear that waste, are there any drugs or things that you're seeing that might be beneficial to be introduced, say, when you're 40 or 50, or maybe preemptively if you're on this trajectory to help clear out that waste and stay on top of it?
Yeah, so we've not proven any of these yet. I think people have had interest in, is there a supplement or a vitamin cocktail that will improve my situation? And some of them at certain times have shown a little bit of promise, and then most of them have faded. And so at the moment, we're not overtly recommending any of these, but people have been interested in, should I be taking, high levels or low levels of certain antioxidant combinations? None of those things have panned out. I think you certainly want to avoid vitamin deficiencies. Some of them in particular other like vitamin B12 and folate can definitely cause memory problems. And so, we want to pay attention that we're not missing obvious things that are contributing. And then you want to stay healthy. I think if you've got a really limited diet, you might need a multivitamin or some supplement to fix that. But the better thing is to give your body the building blocks it needs for a healthy brain from your diet, right? Eat rich, natural things like fruits and vegetables, really colorful things so that your body is getting the resources it needs from the way it's wired to get it,
Mm.
right? When we take those resources and put it in a pill, it's not how your body's wired to get it, and I think it's much less efficient.
That makes sense. So I know we've covered this topic extensively, but you were deep in this field. So from your point of view as a vascular neurologist, is there a cure for Alzheimer's on the horizon?
Boy, I'd like to believe so. I think probably the more pragmatic position is we want to see a disease-modifying treatment. I want to see a treatment that convincingly changes the trajectory for patients. And the other thing that I wouldn't neglect is I would be interested in treatments that improved patients' symptoms, right? We've often dismissed that as sort of a lower tier.
Their
You're not
quality of life.
fixing the actual problem, we're just tamping down the symptoms. But I think if we could find more effective ways to do that, it could be very valuable.
Are there any promising things? So say someone has Alzheimer's, they're starting to progress. Is there anything that's known to help get those memories back or just have a better quality of
Yeah,
life?
historically, we've seen patients respond to a couple of drugs. And I talked about early on in our conversation about how they don't give us as much as we'd like, but they improve the neurotransmitter abundance in the brain. They create more acetylcholine, which is important for memory function. Those tools are still useful. They've been on the market for quite some time now, and they are still useful tools. There was a clinical trial a few years ago of using gentle doses of stimulants for patients, and that actually showed some benefit on some neuropsychological features. And
So
so things like Ritalin.
really?
And so the clinical trial was for Ritalin. And that sort of makes sense. It
Yeah.
helps with what the neuropsychologists call apathy, which is probably not how we formulate apathy, but it's sort of the energy to get going with something, right?
Mhm.
It helps you activate a little bit faster. I
And
think
whether that's eating or getting out of your recliner?
that's right. Getting, into whatever activities for the day. They saw real movement on that with stimulant use. And so I think gently using stimulants can be helpful.
What about for men? Say, especially as they're older, 60s, 70s, hormone modulation with, like, say, testosterone supplementation.
I think certainly addressing deficiencies makes sense. I don't think we've ever proven that supplementing that to what we call non-physiologic levels, higher levels than they're supposed to be, has a clear benefit, and it may have some risks. But certainly, if there are deficiencies, addressing those makes sense, and that's kind of across the board. I think
Right.
that if people get depressed, you should treat the depression. Patients who have end-stage dementia sometimes get seizures. We should go after that aggressively. And so I think part of this is going and identifying other things that are contributing to the problem that we do know how to treat and aggressively tuning them up.
I know my family members who had passed from Alzheimer's during that was something in my mind is like, well, Ritalin can't hurt. Like, give them some amphetamines, it'll probably
Yeah,
do
well, I
something.
would say we have to be careful with that. I think it could hurt, but I think it can be useful in the right patient and especially in cautious doses. But yeah, I think that addressing energy issues,
Mhm.
addressing focus, I think that we know that Ritalin helps with focus. We've seen that from the millions of children we've treated for ADHD. And it turns out focus is a big part of memory. If you don't get the information in, you can't get it back out. And I think that's part of why people are seeing some benefits from the use of stimulants. Again, gentle use of stimulants.
And I mean, it's so healthcare, you have to take responsibility of it first and foremost. But I feel like in the public mind, especially with an older person, once they get diagnosed with Alzheimer's, it's easy to be like, well, that's just what it looks like. He's going to be sitting on the couch watching TV.
Yeah.
But
And
changing that.
I think staying engaged in life is so important. It's so easy when you can no longer drive to get homebound. And it's so easy when you're not going to work anymore, to just disengage socially. It's a big part of people's social life. And I think fighting that, staying engaged, doing as much as you can to stay you,
Mhm.
and not allowing yourself to become sedentary is a big part of succeeding with this disease. And there are some drugs that can help with that, but a big part of it is just an individual and their family coming together and saying, "We're not doing that. We're gonna live better than that." And patients can. Living with Alzheimer's disease doesn't have to be as bleak as it looks in the
Mhm.
movies.
That's good to hear. In your practice, do you see any occupational history that has a higher rate of Alzheimer's?
Not in a dramatic way. We're certainly more attuned now to trauma. I think that head trauma does seem to be across quite a few studies now a clear risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, and that can even be relatively earlier in life than you think. I think repetitive trauma is a problem. So we start to see in certain professional athletes a vulnerability. We certainly see in our soldiers who've been subjected to head trauma that that can be a risk factor. And so I think taking some basic precautions against head trauma is reasonable. But that's part of the process, and it may be part of the same thing that when you traumatize the brain, you disrupt some of that microvascular network that is so delicate and fragile, and you might kick off smoldering inflammation for a fairly
Mm,
long time. And so it's some of the same pathways we've been talking about are really relevant to head trauma.
I see. So, if someone has just been diagnosed with Alzheimer's today and they walked into your office, what would you tell them?
Well, I tell them a couple of things. One is let's fix everything we can fix. So let's make sure that any other factor that's going on, vitamin deficiency, sleep apnea, your hearing, all of those things are tuned up to get you as good as you can get. Let's get you healthy. Let's focus on getting you as healthy as we can make you. That's blood pressure control. That's stop smoking if you need to stop smoking. That's get physically active. That's make sure you get out of your house every day and see the sun. And so there's a suite of things that I encourage people to do. Use the available drugs to the extent that they help you, right? I think that you don't have to take everything just because it's on the market,
Mm,
but it's worth trying the memory enhancing drugs that are out there and seeing if they help you keep your level of function as high as we can, as long as we can. And then finally, a sense of humor goes an awfully long way. So I think once you've put your basic plans in place to deal with the unfortunate inevitabilities of this disease, telling people, like, if you can, like, keep your chin up, laugh at the deficiencies as much as you can, stay engaged, don't let embarrassment keep you
mhm.
at home. The patients who do the best seem to have a good sense of humor.
And for family members caring with someone with Alzheimer's, with my family members, if they were not making sense or just all over the place, I would just go along with it instead of correcting them. Is that the best route?
I think so. I think part of it depends on the scenario, and so people should use their best
Mhm.
judgment. But yeah, I wouldn't feel the need to correct people constantly when they're
Yeah.
in this scenario. I think if there's something that's really important that needs attention, there may be times when you need to. But, yeah, I think rolling with things,
Mhm.
taking a gentle approach to it, I think that people can have very strong emotions about things, and it can be repetitive because people are experiencing things that to you, you've dealt with in the past, but if they have memory problems, they may be re-dealing with freshly for a long time, and so I think having some patience for that is really important, rolling with resistance more than fighting
Mhm.
with people.
And so with end stage Alzheimer's patients, are they aware that they've lost their memory? Is there a certain point to where they're completely gone, or are they still self-aware until the end? How does that
It depends. I think that the experience is different for different people. Let me start by saying far more people die with Alzheimer's disease than die from it. And so I think this notion that people are going to shrivel up into, a shadow of themselves and not recognize their family is not reality for most patients. It is out there. It is a frustrating reality for some people, and that's hard. But I think people are terrified when they get diagnosed with this, that that is inevitable, that that's gonna happen to them, and for a lot of people, it's not. I think for most patients, they don't make it to that stage, that they retain, some level of function. They may need some help, but they still recognize their family, and I think even when people start to lose identities, knowing who people are, the vast majority of them still recognize who their people are. They
Mm,
understand that, these relationships are important to them. And so I think those really horrible stories where people have no sense of self or family are fortunately rare,
mm,
but they are there and they're hard. And I think you just need to approach it with a lot of gentleness and a
mhm.
lot of respect. remembering that these are not children, that these are still adults who have had meaningful lives, and treating them with that respect and understanding their emotions in that context, that it can be very hard to cope with that. And so I think it takes a lot of patience. And I
Yeah.
think that that's a huge challenge for caregivers who are living with this day in and day out. It's easy for somebody on the sidelines to say, just be patient with that, but it can be incredibly hard.
And have you seen any, I've experienced it. My grandfather had Alzheimer's. He sang in churches, recorded CDs. So towards the end, we would play him his music of him singing, and he would be totally lethargic, have apathy in the recliner. We put him on singing, and now he's tapping his foot along,
Yeah,
and he
I
like
have seen it more than you can imagine, and, I think that music therapy is sort of, in a very early stage. We don't really know what it does or how exactly it does what it does. Um, but I think a lot of us have seen people respond in pretty dramatic ways to music. It can be very calming. In some ways, it can be activating, can get people to engage when nothing else does, and
is that because just different parts of the brain process?
I gotta be honest with you, I have no idea why it works, but I've seen it, and I've had lots of folks say that, that if we, one thing I hear a lot is people struggle with hygiene. Getting people to shower can be really hard, and a lot of people have said, if I get the bathroom really nice and I turn on their favorite music from when they were teenagers, all of a sudden this is much easier, and I get it. It makes
Mm.
sense to me.
So last 2 questions. Does nicotine, because I use nicotine, have any benefit against neurodegenerative diseases? And
Uh
in the sense of, say, pure nicotine pouches,
Yeah,
no dipping, nothing.
that's a tough question for a physician. Um,
Off the record.
Probably. So it looks like there is some protective effect of nicotine on Parkinson's disease. It's a little bit less clear for Alzheimer's disease. Um the negative, factors of smoking dramatically outweigh those benefits, and so we certainly don't want people smoking, but the biggest problems with smoking is you're sucking in all of this tar and soot into your lungs, and it's not necessarily the nicotine that's the biggest issue. We have also concerns about vaping. Generally speaking, I will take vaping and trade over smoking, but we're still not that thrilled about vaping. And I think there are some concerns about whether nicotine itself could have some problems in the long term, but the clearest evidence is that it's the soot and the tar
Mhm.
from smoking, and that is the biggest driver. And nicotine is obviously a neurologically very active compound, and absolutely improves focus and seems to have some protective effects in Parkinson's disease. I'm not sure we know how to leverage that yet.
Mm. And without getting too deep into that, say we were talking strictly nicotine pouches or
Mhm.
patches. What is the theory about how that might protect against Parkinson's? And if, say, blood pressure is controlled, lifestyle is controlled, if you're just using these nicotine pouches or patches?
Yeah. Well, I talked to you a little bit about the acetylcholine, this neurotransmitter that helps with memory. And one of the receptors for it is a nicotinic receptor. And so nicotine can activate that receptor and can activate some of these memory pathways. And it's part of why it's so addictive, I think, is that it's binding to a pretty potent neurotransmitter receptor and activating pathways that feel good, right?
Mhm.
And so that's part of why it's such an addictive molecule. And I would caution people that it is nicotine that is the addictive
Mhm.
component. And so you have to be cautious with that. But it definitely helps people with focus,
Mm.
and it can help people feel sharper.
Okay, so for people out there, testosterone, Ritalin, nicotine, just kidding. We'll get you juiced
Oh,
up.
this has gone off the rails now.
Last question about this sphere with neurology. After I got out of the military, I experienced a lot of benefit from psychedelic therapy, psychedelic assisted
Mm.
therapy. And there's a lot of research programs in the military realm with MDMA, psilocybin. As a neurologist, what's your view on psilocybin mushrooms for brain and mental health?
I think it's an interesting topic for research. I think a lot of these things get stigmatized because they're drugs of abuse and they're associated with a lot of potential societal risk. And so, a lot of them have been sidelined, but they're also, um, neurologically very active compounds. These get in the brain and do interesting things. And I think under supervised settings, there may be some potential, for these things to be valuable. I would worry in the setting of neurodegenerative diseases, you're dealing with pretty vulnerable population, delicate population, and these things are unlikely to be safe in that population. And so I would tend to tell people that this is still very much in an experimental space and should be closely supervised in a very controlled environment, and is not ready for prime time. But conceptually, these compounds do absolutely get in the brain and do some interesting things, and there may be some interesting neuroscience to get out of that.
Yeah, and I feel like the in the 70s, scheduling these as Schedule 1 drugs kind of stopped that vein of research into how they affect the brain.
Yeah, I've certainly, I'm sure it did some of that. I think it made it harder to study, but also, these things have their risks, and I
Right.
think that figuring out how to control them and whether there is a medicinal value is not that straightforward, and I think is an active area of research. I mean, there are folks who are actively studying this.
So wrapping up, after everything we've talked about, I mean, 20 years of Alzheimer's research, if somebody's listening to this, they have family members with Alzheimer's, they're feeling frustrated, angry at the institutions, or they feel betrayed by these institutions that were supposed to protect them, what would you tell them?
Well, I think that to my colleagues, I think that it's time for us to step up. To patients, I would hope that they would hang in there with us. I hope they hear the story and they recognize that it's not just me. It's a lot of people who are trying to change the conversation on this topic and trying to acknowledge reality, because I think that's how we make progress forward. I'm not trying to destroy science. I'm not trying to get people to shut the system down. I want to improve this process, and I hope they hear this and it builds confidence, right? I think that, when Saddam Hussein gets 98% of the vote, nobody believes it, right? And I hope that people understand when they hear us candidly, openly talking about the problems in science at large, that it's not destructive, that that's not the objective. What we want to do is build this process up, be candid about where the problems lie so we can work on them and create a system that's going to serve them better. Ultimately, we're trying to serve our patients. And so I would hope patients hear this and, one, recognize there's some honesty behind it and that there's lots of people in the system, huge numbers of people in the system who are trying to make the world a better place, and don't give up on us, and stay engaged in clinical trials. That's the only way we make it forward, is if we have this really special partnership with patients who are willing to take a risk at a vulnerable moment in their life. That's the only way we're going to get new drugs. And in turn, we need to be worthy of that trust. Right? I don't want to manipulate the public or a group of patients into trusting us as physicians or as scientists. I want to earn that trust. And I think that that's the key change in the conversation, right? I don't want to say some magic words or not bring up uncomfortable topics and manipulate people into trusting us. I want them to trust us because we're out there committed to doing good work. That's it. I just want to do a good job, and I'm going to trust that patients are going to see that and continue to participate in clinical trials.
Well spoken. I want to thank you for your time, doctor, and people like yourself and reading about your story give me hope in the institutions that there's people out there willing to stand up for what's right and put their reputation on the line. So, Dr. Matthew Schrag, thank you.
It's been my pleasure.